everyone, my name is Abby Backman and welcome to my video essay. What do you think of when someone says fantasy setting? I bet a castle popped into your head, maybe some swords and battle axes, big feasts with refilling goblets, enchanted forests, the list goes on. What most of these items have in common is that they have some sort of connection to medieval times, specifically medieval Europe. This association of medieval Europe with fantasy setting originates all the way back to early fantasy authors like Tolkien, whose classic books have successfully established this very strong correlation. This association of medieval Europe with fantasy is well known, and not necessarily a bad thing on its own. The problem with this convention, however, is that these settings usually don't only mirror the physical aspects of medieval Europe, but also some harmful stereotypes and ideas. What we'll be looking at today is how Jemisin, in her novel The 100,000 Kingdoms, points out these problematic aspects of this convention, and how she uses the world building and plot of this novel to show how the genre can change and move away from the standard set up by early high fantasy authors. To put into context exactly how she does this, let's first look at how Jemisin's world building, specifically her depictions of Sky and the Armari people, mirror both the physical aspects of the medieval European settings of traditional high fantasy and the problematic ideas that go with it. When Yin first gets to the city of Sky, she sees a street full of carriages. The imagery of horse-drawn carriages is strongly associated with medieval Europe, dating back to the Middle Ages. The passing on of power in Sky also mimics the British monarchy, with power being passed through the family bloodline. Jemisin uses these immediate correlations with medieval Europe to establish Sky as a mirror of traditional high fantasy settings, like Tolkien's world of Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's novels do not use as inspiration for only physical settings, however, but also use problematic Eurocentric ideals to shape how the different races and cultures are perceived. The binary of good and evil peoples he defines in his novels is explored by Young, who connects Tolkien's depiction of people associated with elves as good to the theory of polygenesis. I won't get too into detail about polygenesis, but in simple terms, it is a theory that humans did not evolve from a common source. This theory has been used to justify racial hierarchies, and Young connects this to Tolkien's view of elves as good by showing that other fantasy races, specifically ones that don't have ties to European culture like the elves do, can be perceived as non-human, which then allows them to be seen as subhuman. This is obviously bad, and since Tolkien's influence is widespread, these harmful ideals are propagated throughout newer fantasy novels. We can see how Jemisin criticizes this problematic idea by again looking at how she sets up her world building. Let's now focus on the Armari people. Jemisin portrays the Armari people as stuck-up and pretentious, with similar opinions about cultures that aren't their own. Yin is criticized by them for her mixed-race looks and her Dar features, and one even says that Yin would have to be dressed in their clothes to be seen as civilized. This shows how negatively the Armari view Yin's culture, and the emphasis on Am clothes being civilized compared to her Dar clothes reveals right away that the Armari think that they are above the Dar. The Armari also believe themselves to be the chosen race, trusted by Bright a Tempest to rule over the land. This belief of superiority and of being chosen again closely relates to the Eurocentric ideas of Tolkien. Not only does the city of Sky have physical parallels to the traditional medieval European setting, but the Armari also exhibit behaviors that match the Eurocentric opinions seen commonly in early fantasy novels. Now that we've established the parallels between the Armari and the dominant cultures of early fantasy novels, we can talk about how Jemisin criticizes this. Jemisin specifically chooses the narrator and protagonist of The 100,000 Kingdoms to be an outsider. We meet Yin as she is going to Sky for the first time, and it becomes very clear in the first few pages that she has a negative view of Sky and her Armari relatives, which becomes especially evident when she compares the city to an inbred, deformed rose. This immediate blatant dislike of the Armari and their city from the narrator allows the reader to separate themselves from the instinct to trust the familiar structure of whiteness and Eurocentricity that are so common in high fantasy. Jemisin also doesn't include a map at the start of the book, which Melville argues is intentional, and stops the reader from entering the novel with a preconceived bias to the colonial cartographic gaze, as maps encourage the reader to be biased towards the mapmaker, who is almost always the colonizer. The ending also shows Jemisin's disapproval of this convention. At the end of the novel, Yin becomes a god and upsets the rule of a Tempest and the Aramari. She does not kill them or replace them, as that would be upholding the same beliefs, just with another dominant culture. Instead, she appoints the lower Aramari as ruler, challenging them to change. By upsetting the system, not replacing it, Jemisin allows for the consideration of other possible settings, without an all-powerful dominant Eurocentric culture, and leaves the reader doubting the necessity of this convention. In conclusion, Jemisin challenges the structure of fantasy novel setting being medieval by showing a parallel of traditional fantasy settings through the perspective of an outsider. She shows her criticism by having Sky mimic a traditional Eurocentric setting, but showing it through Yin's outsider perspective, then challenging how necessary the structure really is by showing its fragility and providing an alternative. Thank you so much for watching!